A man aged in his 70s has become the latest Victorian to die from coronavirus as the state records 273 new cases. Students from prep to year 10 in the locked down Greater Melbourne area and Mitchell Shire will return to homeschooling from the 20th of July in an effort to contain the coronavirus outbreak. Meanwhile, it's been confirmed today that travellers returning to New South Wales will be billed $3,000 for their 14 days of hotel quarantine. Reporter Margaret Paul is in Melbourne and we have New South Wales political reporter Ash Raper in Sydney. First to you, Margaret, just take us through those latest figures out from Victoria.
Oh yeah, a really dispiriting morning here in Melbourne as this is the first weekend of that second lockdown. Now we knew it would be a while before we start to hopefully see the numbers taper off, but as you mentioned in that introduction, 273 new infections here in Victoria. I'm here in North Melbourne out the front of the public housing flats where there's been a cluster, and one of the numbers that was confirmed at this morning's press conference was that the number of 145 is the new number from the infections in the housing estate here in North Melbourne and Flemington, and also worryingly 22 in the public housing flats in Carlton as well. So they're just some of the numbers as well. A hospital cluster. The Alfred Hospital in Melbourne has had 8 staff members test positive, which is worrying. And you just think about all the pressure that that's putting on the contact tracers that have to contact everyone who's been in contact with those staff members and all the people in the flats. So, a lot here in Melbourne.
It is a lot of work there, some 1,500 active cases. So, Margaret, just take us through as well what the Premier Daniel Andrews had to say about schools today.
Yep, and so the Premier and the Chief Health Officer at that media conference we've just seen earlier, talking about, yes, parents will have to go back to remote learning, which was such a challenge for so many parents and families and schools last time, and they will have to do it all over again. And the Premier said this was an extremely difficult decision to make, but it has to be done, was the way that he phrased it, to reduce all those people dropping off, picking up, coming into contact throughout the state. Let's hear from what the Premier had to say.
I know this will be very, very challenging for many, many parents. There is simply no alternative but to go to this footing. We can't have the best part of 700,000 students, as well as parents, moving to and from school, moving around the community as if there wasn't a stay-at-home order, as if there wasn't a lockdown. That'll put at direct risk us achieving our aim, and that of course is to drive these numbers down at the end of the 6-week period and get to a position where we have control.
Daniel Andrews there. And Margaret, some interesting use of language from the Premier Daniel Andrews as well, saying that everyone in Victoria is essentially on the front line with fighting this latest outbreak there. How are people coping with lockdown the second time around?
Everyone is affected in Victoria, but everyone is affected differently. I'm in North Melbourne outside these flats where people who are classed as close contacts of people who have tested positive to coronavirus, so they have to stay inside. We've been speaking to lawyers who are in touch with the people inside who are concerned that they're not able to access enough fresh air and exercise. Overnight we saw reports of a temporary fencing being set up and then quickly removed. So and that's to try and get the residents exercise. So that's one way. But of course, gosh, parents of especially young children who managed to get through remote learning last time, it's really just feels like a kick in the guts for those parents. I'm one of them. My friends are them. So it's, everyone is affected. But I'd like to also tell you, we heard from a man in his 90s who died from coronavirus. His family spoke to ABC News yesterday and spoke about how hard it is having your loved one die from coronavirus and not be able to visit them when they're dying. So every Victorian, and especially Melburnians and in the Mitchell Shire, we are all affected, but it affects different people in different ways. And everyone who is affected, who is the most affected, who I've spoken to, the message has been the same, and the same from the health authorities. Please be safe, stay home unless you need to go out for those 4 essential reasons. Wear a mask if you can't safely socially distance from people. it is everyone's responsibility to make sure that we are not affected in those really, really horrible ways.
A massive undertaking. Our reporter Margaret Paul there in Melbourne. Let's now go to Sydney and Ash Raper, who has been listening to the New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian speak in Sydney today. So Ash, just give us some detail, particularly around that pub cluster that we've been hearing about.
Miriam, an 18-year-old staff member at the Crossroads Hotel in Casula here in Sydney has tested positive for coronavirus. So that takes the total number of cases associated with that particular pub to 6. Now, this worker worked on the 3rd of July, and that is a crucial date here when dealing with this cluster at the Crossroads Hotel, because 2 patrons who went there separately on the 3rd of July, last Friday, a week ago Friday, were there and they had tested positive for coronavirus. Now, this worker worked that night, the 3rd of July, that Friday night, but he also worked subsequent days. So when New South Wales Health have been looking at dealing with this outbreak at the Crossroads Hotel, they've been focusing on the Friday night, the 3rd of July, and on that night there are at least 600 people at that hotel. But now this worker has tested positive. They're now looking further afield and the days after. So now between the 3rd of July and the 10th of July, anybody who was at that pub has been told to immediately self-isolate, stay at home and wait to hear from New South Wales Health. If they have any symptoms, please go and get tested, is the message from New South Wales Health. Now, the Premier said, yes, this may seem extreme and potentially it does affect hundreds, if not thousands, of people who went to this pub, this very large pub, the Crossroads Hotel in Casula. But Gladys Berejiklian says this is necessary to stop the spread of this virus.
We want our absolute focus to be on clamping down on community transmission in New South Wales. That's where we're at. That's how serious things are. We have literally the next few weeks to continue on the strong path we've been on. Otherwise, we'll go down the path of Victoria. It's up to us. And as government, we need to make the decisions, but also send very strong signals to everybody about what our focus needs to be. It's about stopping that community transmission.
Gladys Berejiklian there. And Ashley, we also heard from the Premier giving confirmation that travellers returning to New South Wales from overseas will be charged for their hotel quarantine. What's involved there?
Yes, Miriam, this has been foreshadowed by the Premier, but has been officially announced today that from next week, everybody who returns, an adult that returns from overseas, will be charged $3,000. Now, for families, it won't be $3,000 per person. So it's $3,000 for the first adult, $1,000 for the second, and then children will be $500 each over the age of 3. So for a family of 4, it's around $5,000, $6,000. Now, the Premier has made no apologies about this. She said there will be a hardship fund if people have certain circumstances that they can't pay the $3,000 bill, but she insists that people have had enough time to return. This is 3 to 4 months now that people have had the opportunity to leave their life overseas and come back to Australia if that's what they need to do. So this will come into effect from next Saturday, but you have till tonight to book a ticket. So you're overseas, you have till midnight tonight to book a ticket. It might not have to be for this week, but in a couple of months, but you can still avoid paying that $3,000 if you book a flight home within the next 12 hours.
So our reporter Ash Raper there in Sydney, and also our reporter Margaret Paul in Melbourne, giving us the latest there on the coronavirus situation in New South Wales and Victoria.